In May of 2019, a remotely operated vehicle descended more than 5 kilometers into the Philippine Sea and approached the wreck of a Japanese heavy cruiser. The ship had been missing for almost 75 years. Its bow had broken away. Its bridge was scarred by fire and battle damage. Sections of deck had collapsed. Yet near the center of the wreck, one of the most important pieces of evidence was still there. Then another. And another. All 4 of Chokai's twin torpedo launcher mounts could still be identified on the wreck. The launcher structures had not been blown apart. The visible tubes were empty. That mattered because for decades one of the best-known explanations for Chokai's loss said that American 5-inch gunfire had reached the cruiser's Type 93 torpedoes and caused a devastating explosion. The sequence seemed to fit. Chokai had been hit. Fire and an apparent secondary explosion had been reported. The ship lost propulsion and dropped out of formation. No surviving Chokai account could explain exactly what happened inside the cruiser. But the wreck did not look like a ship whose torpedo warheads had detonated catastrophically. The ROV had not solved the entire loss of Chokai. It had done something more precise. It had ruled out one of the most repeated explanations for how the cruiser was crippled. To understand why that mattered, the story has to return to a ship that had once been one of the most dangerous cruisers in the Japanese fleet. Chokai was laid down at Nagasaki in March of 1928, launched 3 years later, and completed in June of 1932. She was the 4th ship of the Takao class, a group of heavy cruisers built around speed and long-range firepower. Their enormous bridge towers made them instantly recognizable. Chokai carried 10 8-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, 4 older 4.7-inch secondary guns, and 4 twin launchers for 8 24-inch torpedo tubes. Those torpedoes would later become central to the story of her loss. For most of the 1930s, Chokai trained, patrolled, and spent long periods operating off China. One of the stranger incidents of her early wartime career came in December of 1941. During the Japanese search for the British Force Z, Japanese scout aircraft mistook Chokai for an enemy ship and reported her position. 53 Japanese bombers were sent toward the contact. The cruiser was recognized before they attacked. Chokai survived that mistake and went on to operate across Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. But the battle that established her reputation came in August of 1942. On the night of August 8th and 9th, Chokai served as Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's flagship during the Battle of Savo Island. The Japanese force entered the waters north of Guadalcanal and struck Allied cruisers guarding the invasion area. Canberra was crippled. Quincy and Vincennes went down. Astoria burned for hours before sinking the following day. Chokai helped lead that attack, but she did not escape untouched. Allied return fire struck the cruiser. Her forward No. 1 turret was knocked out, and 34 men aboard were killed. The ship survived, was repaired, and returned to service. The months after Savo showed that Chokai could absorb damage without being easily removed from service. In November of 1942, during operations around Guadalcanal, near misses from dive bombers caused flooding and temporarily disabled 2 boiler rooms. Even then, the cruiser was able to withdraw at high speed and reach Truk for repairs. The episode was very different from Samar. In 1942, damage reduced Chokai's power, but did not trap her. In 1944, the engines would go out while enemy aircraft and surface ships were still close enough to keep attacking. After Guadalcanal, Chokai spent long stretches on escort, transport, and training duties. She survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 without major damage. By the time the Japanese fleet assembled for the defense of the Philippines in October, the cruiser had already survived 3 years of war, several major campaigns, and repeated attacks. None of that made her immune to what happened off Samar, but it explains why her sudden loss there was so striking. That history matters because 2 years after Savo, Chokai would enter another cruiser battle under almost reversed conditions. At Savo Island, Japanese ships had achieved surprise and used their night fighting tactics with devastating effect. Off Samar, Chokai would be part of a force armed with weapons far heavier than those of the American escorts ahead of it. Yet within minutes, the cruiser would be burning, losing propulsion, and falling out of formation. The path to that morning began on October 23, 1944, as Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force moved through the Palawan Passage toward the Philippines. American submarines were waiting, USS Darter torpedoed Otago, Kurita's flagship, and sent her to the bottom. USS Dace sank Maya. Takao was badly damaged and forced to withdraw. In a matter of hours, 3 of the 4 Takao-class cruisers in the formation had either been sunk or removed from the battle. Chokai remained. The following day, American carrier aircraft attacked center force in the Sibuyan Sea. The battleship Musashi was sunk, other Japanese ships were damaged. Chokai again came through without major damage. So when dawn broke on October 25th, Chokai entered the battle off Samar as the only one of those 4 sister ships still able to fight at full strength. What Kurita's force found off Samar was not the main American battle fleet. It was Taffy 3, a small escort carrier group protected by destroyers and destroyer escorts. The Japanese force included battleships and heavy cruisers, with guns powerful enough to destroy those ships at long range. On paper, the mismatch was extreme. In practice, the battle became chaotic almost immediately. The sighting itself was unexpected. Kurita's force had passed through San Bernardino Strait, believing the main American carrier force had been drawn away. Instead, lookouts found small carriers off Samar, apparently exposed. Kurita ordered a general attack. Individual Japanese columns pursued targets at different speeds and bearings, making it harder to concentrate fire and easier for the American escorts to disrupt the chase. For Chokai, the important consequence was range. As the cruiser closed, the American screen came close enough for 5-inch guns to matter. Those shells could not match an 8-inch shell in destructive power, but hits could still damage exposed equipment, start fires, and disrupt the systems that kept a cruiser fighting. The American carriers turned away and launched aircraft. Destroyers and destroyer escorts attacked much larger ships with torpedoes and 5-inch gunfire. Smoke screens spread across the water. Japanese ships maneuvered around attacks while trying to keep contact with targets that were disappearing into smoke, rain, shell splashes, and evasive turns. Chokai pressed toward the escort carriers. Her 10 8-inch guns were designed to fight cruisers. The weapons answering her included 5-inch guns from ships so much smaller that, under ordinary circumstances, they should not have been able to trade fire on equal terms. They did not need to fight on equal terms. They only needed to damage Chokai enough to stop her. At about 8:51 in the morning, observers aboard the Japanese cruiser Haguro saw Chokai under concentrated fire. Haguro's detailed action report placed hits around Chokai's starboard side amidships. That observation is one of the most important pieces of surviving evidence because it comes from another Japanese ship watching the battle as it happened. Who fired each shell is harder to establish. USS White Plains had a single 5-inch gun and fired on a Japanese heavy cruiser, most likely Chokai, before shifting to other targets. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts was also fighting Japanese cruisers at close range and fired heavily during the action. Other American escorts were shooting as well. The surviving records do not let us assign every hole in Chokai's side to one American gun. What they do establish is the sequence. At 8:51, Chokai was seen taking hits amidships. 8 minutes later, at 8:59, Chokai transmitted that her engines were out of commission. That is the crucial turning point. The timing also helps separate the different phases of damage. The surface engagement was not over when Chokai reported its engines out. The later air attacks therefore cannot explain the first moment at which the cruiser lost the ability to keep up with the formation. They can explain why an already damaged ship became progressively harder to save. This is an important distinction because many summaries compress the whole morning into one dramatic sentence. In reality, Chokai was damaged in stages. The surviving Japanese observations give us a before and after, but not the complete engineering chain between them. Somewhere between the shell hits seen at 8:51 and the engine report 8 minutes later, the ship crossed from active pursuit to a casualty that could no longer maintain its place in the attack. The cruiser had not simply been stopped by the aircraft attacks that followed. During the surface engagement itself, Chokai suffered enough damage to lose propulsion and begin dropping away from Kurita's formation. The exact path from shell hit to engine failure is not documented. The amidships area contained machinery spaces below and the torpedo installations above, and serious fires developed in the center of the ship. But no surviving report lets us trace one projectile through the hull and say with certainty that this was the shell that stopped the engines. That uncertainty is where the torpedo story took hold. Chokai carried Type 93 torpedoes, the powerful oxygen-driven weapons used by Japanese surface ships throughout the Pacific War. Their range and heavy warheads gave Japanese cruisers enormous striking power, especially at night. But carrying large torpedo warheads on a cruiser also created a serious danger when the ship itself caught fire. At Samar, that danger was not theoretical. Another Japanese cruiser, Suzuya, was devastated after battle damage and fire reached her torpedoes. Explosions tore through the ship and helped turn an already damaged cruiser into a total loss. So when historians later tried to reconstruct Chokai's fate, the pieces seemed to line up. American 5-inch shells had reached the cruiser. There was severe damage and fire in the central part of the ship. An apparent secondary explosion was associated with the damage. Then Chokai reported that its engines were no longer working. A famous version of the story developed from those facts. A shell, often credited to White Plains, had supposedly struck Chokai's torpedo area and detonated the Type 93s. The resulting blast had crippled the cruiser. It was not an absurd theory. With the evidence available at the time, it was a plausible reconstruction. There was just one problem. No one had seen the wreck, and the battle was still going on. Once Chokai lost speed and fell away from the Japanese formation, the situation became worse. American carrier aircraft were already attacking Kurita's ships throughout the engagement. Avengers from USS Kitkun Bay came down on the damaged cruiser. Japanese reporting later recorded damage to Chokai's forward engine room during the air attack. American air crews claimed additional bomb hits. The wreck itself shows damage across several areas consistent with a ship that endured both surface fire and air attack. There is no reliable basis for reducing that sequence to one perfect blow. The chronology is clearer than the exact mechanism. Shellfire hit Chokai amidships. Serious fires and damage developed. The engines went out. The cruiser left formation. Aircraft then attacked an isolated ship and caused further damage, including to the forward machinery spaces. By 9:55, the Japanese cruiser Tone observed Chokai stopped. Kurita ordered the destroyer Fujinami to go to her assistance. For Chokai's crew, the objective had changed completely. Only hours earlier, they had been part of a force trying to destroy American escort carriers. Now their cruiser was burning and immobile, while the rest of Center Force moved away. Fujinami took survivors aboard. Later that evening, the destroyer removed the remaining survivors and scuttled Chokai with torpedoes. At 9:48, Fujinami reported the cruiser sunk. 2 days later, U.S. carrier aircraft found Fujinami and sank her. The Chokai survivors aboard went down with the destroyer. That loss had an unusual historical consequence. Reports survived from Haguro, Tone, American surface ships, and American aircraft. They could show what other crews saw from outside Chokai, but the surviving men who had been aboard the cruiser during those critical minutes were gone. For decades, historians reconstructed the loss from the reports that remained. The torpedo detonation explanation survived because it fitted much of what was known and because there was no physical wreck evidence available to test it. Chokai lay far beyond the reach of ordinary divers. Then, in 2019, the research vessel Petrel began searching the battlefield. On May 5th, the expedition located a wreck at the edge of the Philippine Deep. On May 30th, an ROV descended to examine it. The depth was 5,173 meters, nearly 17,000 feet. The main hull lay upright. The enormous bridge structure was still standing. All 5 main gun turrets remained with the central wreck. The bow forward of the first turret had separated and come to rest roughly 300 meters away, inverted. An aircraft catapult had also fallen into the debris field. The survey showed a ship that had endured both battle damage and a violent sinking. The bridge and central superstructure carried evidence of heavy fire. Parts of the aft deck had collapsed. Fire hoses still lay across sections of the wreck, silent traces of the damage control effort before the ship was abandoned. The wreck also preserved clues that fit the battle without settling every detail. Some guns remained elevated, including secondary weapons pointing toward the stern, consistent with a ship that had been fighting aircraft, though their final positions cannot prove exactly what they were firing at. The stern was heavily collapsed. The rudder was found close to the center line rather than locked dramatically to one side. That does not prove Chokai's steering was fully functional. but it cautions against treating older reconstructions as photographs of what happened. The detached bow was equally ambiguous. It rested inverted away from the main hull. Fujinami had used torpedoes to scuttle Chokai, but the wreck alone cannot prove when the bow separated. Damage during the scuttling, structural failure during the descent, or both remain possible. What the wreck could show more confidently was whether a particular area carried the destruction required by a particular theory. That is why the torpedo launchers mattered more than the collapsed stern or broken bow. Chokai had carried 4 twin launcher mounts, 2 on each side of the ship. The ROV found them. The forward starboard mount was still there. The aft starboard mount was still there. The port side mounts could also be identified. The launcher structures had not been erased by a massive internal explosion. The visible tubes were trained inward, in their stowed positions, and they were empty. There was fire and structural damage around the area. Some plating had been destroyed or weakened. Sections of the surrounding structure were badly deteriorated. Fire may have reached oxygen equipment or other material in the torpedo spaces. But the launcher area had not been blown apart in the way expected from a catastrophic detonation of the torpedo warheads. That distinction changes the story. The wreck does not show that white planes failed to hit Chokai. White planes may well have hit her, and Japanese observers definitely saw shell impacts during the same period. Nor does the wreck make American 5-inch fire unimportant. The Japanese chronology shows that Chokai lost propulsion during the surface engagement, before later air attacks added more damage. What the wreck changes is narrower and more specific. The torpedo warheads did not detonate in the manner long used to explain the cruiser's sudden loss of fighting power. And the empty tubes create another question. Where did the torpedoes go? Some may have been fired during the battle. Others may have been jettisoned after the ship was hit, especially if fires were threatening the torpedo battery. Both things may have happened. The wreck cannot distinguish among those possibilities. Empty tubes show only that the weapons were no longer there when the ship went down. That is why Chokai's story should not be replaced with another neat single-cause explanation. The discovery in 2019 did not identify the exact shell that stopped the engines. It did not establish which American ship was responsible for every hit. It did not provide a precise count of the bombs that struck Chokai after she dropped out of formation. What the evidence supports is a sequence. Chokai entered the battle largely undamaged. At about 8:51, she was hit amidships by concentrated American fire. At 8:59, she reported that her engines were out of commission. She fell away from the Japanese formation. American aircraft then attacked the crippled cruiser and caused further damage, including to the forward engine room. By mid-morning, she was stopped. Fujinami removed survivors. That evening, the destroyer scuttled the ship. 2 days later, the destroyer carrying those survivors was itself sunk. For 75 years, the absence of direct testimony left room for a reasonable but untested explanation. Then a camera reached the ship. More than 5 kilometers below the Philippine Sea, Chokai still lies upright, separated from its bow and surrounded by debris from its final descent. The bridge that once towered over the deck is scarred and open to the sea. 5 main turrets still mark the centerline. And amidships, the 4 torpedo launcher mounts remain. The wreck cannot tell us which shell dealt the decisive wound, or whether the missing torpedoes were fired, thrown overboard, or both. But it can correct one part of the story. The torpedo battery was not blown apart. At more than 5 kilometers beneath the Philippine Sea, Chokai still cannot tell us exactly which blow killed her. But its empty torpedo tubes and the launcher structures still surrounding them tell us which one did not.